Hey guys, tonight, we're opening the door to a topic that tiptoes on the edge of scandal and scholarship, a subject whispered through the centuries, blushing behind veils and velvet curtains. The intimate, perplexing, and at times hilariously bewildering world of medieval sex. This wasn't a world of modern comfort or privacy. It was a world of chivalry wrapped in contradictions and herbal remedies that were as questionable as they were creative. A time when seduction might begin with a polite nod and end with a prayer that no one, including the family goat, was watching. But before we dive into candlelit chaos and clumsy courtship, do take a second to like this video and subscribe only if what I do here makes you pause, smile, or tilt your head in curiosity. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? What time is it where you are right now? Drop a comment. It's always strangely comforting to see the little constellation of names and time zones we create together. Now, dim the lights. Maybe switch on a fan or settle into that perfect quiet corner. Let the world fade for a moment. You're safe here. And tonight, we begin not with romance, but with reality. Because contrary to popular fantasy, medieval intimacy rarely took place under silk sheets, accompanied by the gentle strum of a lute and the glow of beeswax candles. More often, it unfolded in a cramped, single-room cottage, one filled with children, grandparents, a handful of livestock, and yes, even the occasional chicken, with absolutely no respect for personal boundaries. Privacy, as we think of it, simply didn't exist. Most peasants lived in homes where the kitchen, bedroom, and stable were technically the same square footage, just with different smells. If a couple wanted some alone time, they had to get creative. Timing mattered. So did volume. And ideally, so did whether the kids were asleep and facing the wall. Curtains were a luxury. Beds were shared. And even among the upper classes, servants might be asleep at the foot of the bed or standing in the corner pretending not to notice anything. Many noble households kept records of bedroom arrangements for legal or religious reasons, which is exactly as awkward as it sounds. Traveling also didn't help. Inns often had shared beds. That's right, total strangers might sleep side by side for the night, which made things even more complicated. Want a little affection? You better check if there's already someone in the bed and whether or not they brought their boots. If you were married and both parties were still awake and reasonably clean, you could share a mattress of straw and hope for the best. If you weren't married, well, you had to be twice as quiet and 3 times as careful. Communities were small, walls were thin, and gossip traveled faster than plague rats. For those living in monasteries or convents, the rule was simple. No privacy, no distractions, and certainly no late-night whispers. But even there, human nature occasionally made things complicated, which explains why many abbeys had unusually high garden walls. In the medieval world, few things shaped private life more than the church, and it had a lot to say about what went on behind closed doors, or more accurately, behind shared curtains. According to church teachings, physical intimacy had one primary function: making more people. That was it. Not pleasure, not bonding, not stress relief, just reproduction. Everything else distracting at best, sinful at worst. This wasn't just Sunday sermon material. Bishops, theologians, and confessors wrote detailed instructions on what was and wasn't acceptable in case anyone dared to improvise. Certain days of the week were off limits. So were major feast days, fasting days, holy days, and in some regions, entire liturgical seasons. Want to be close to your spouse during Lent? Think again. Advent also no. That left maybe Tuesdays in April. Even within marriage, there were expectations. Couples were encouraged to approach one another with modesty and restraint. Expressions of affection were acceptable, but not excessive. Displays of passion were, to put it mildly, highly discouraged. A 13th century guide, equal parts moral handbook and buzzkill, advised that married couples should engage in intimacy without pleasure, without sin, and without delay. It reads less like a moment of connection and more like a chore on a sanctified to-do list. The recommended position? Missionary, of course, and not for reasons of comfort or romance, but because it was considered the most natural and therefore least likely to ruffle the feathers of God, the saints, or your ever-watchful local priest. Any variation, physical or emotional, was viewed with suspicion. Even something as human, as harmless, as enthusiasm was enough to set off theological alarm bells. Confession, too, waded into the bedroom. Priests routinely asked deeply personal and often startlingly specific questions during confession. These weren't abstract queries about virtue. No, they were practical, pointed, and surprisingly detailed. It turns out your average 14th century friar probably knew more about your nighttime rituals than your birth date. It was less forgiveness of sin and more an ecclesiastical interrogation. Still, enforcement was uneven. Some priests took these rules with deadly seriousness, their moral fervor applied with the zeal of a courtroom scribe. Others, perhaps sensing the absurdity, looked the other way. Because let's be honest, the church's doctrine was one thing, but the lived reality was another, and the peasants? They simply nodded, smiled, and carried on doing whatever they intended to do in the first place, quietly and ideally, out of earshot of the nearest chapel bell. If you think today's couples have a hard time aligning calendars, spare a moment for medieval lovers. Organizing a romantic evening in the Middle Ages required divine coordination. A clear sky, no feast day, a priest's passive consent, and a rare alignment of privacy, which was no small feat in homes shared with children, elders, and curious livestock. Even Saint Valentine, the modern-day patron of romance, would have struggled. Ironically, he was never married, and yet his name has been forever tied to the idea of love. While his era did everything it could to regulate it, the church had opinions. And by opinions, we mean strict, occasionally contradictory prohibitions. For example, intimacy was forbidden on more than a third of the calendar year. Sundays? Absolutely not. That was the Lord's Day. Advent? No. Lent? Definitely no. Feast days? Better not. Days before feast days? Still no. Love, in short, had to be carefully scheduled. And if it happened at all, it was expected to be brief, joyless, and properly contrite. But despite it all, love persisted. Quietly, resiliently, and sometimes even defiantly. Because for all the rules written in ink, humans were still made of warmth, desire, and the unshakable need to connect no matter what the rulebook said. Fridays, still no day of penance. Wednesdays, suspicious. Add in Lent, 40 days. Advent, another 40. Various saints' feast days, holy days, fast days, and even certain moon phases. And you'll find the calendar was less of a schedule and more of a divine obstacle course. The idea was to keep the soul focused on heaven even when the body had other ideas. There were even lists, actual lists of forbidden days. Some confession manuals outlined nearly half the year as off-limits. And if you were feeling particularly affectionate during one of those forbidden days, well, enjoy your spiritual guilt and an extra trip to confession. One 13th century bishop scolded a married couple for their excessive affection, which translated to more than once a month. He recommended they direct their passion toward prayer. The couple was reportedly not thrilled. Naturally, the upper classes were more exposed to these restrictions. They had chaplain, confessors, and spiritual advisors breathing down their necks. Peasants, meanwhile, had a more flexible approach. Their lives revolved around livestock, weather, and not freezing to death, which left less time for worrying about whether Tuesday was the feast of Saint None. To make things worse, some believed that intimacy during the wrong time could result in sickly children, divine punishment, or worst of all, a reputation. If your neighbors caught wind that you were celebrating a little too enthusiastically during Lent, it could lead to shame, gossip, or a strongly worded sermon delivered with maximum eye contact. So yes, romance in medieval Europe did exist, just not always where or how you'd expect. It wasn't woven into grand gestures or whispered love letters. It bloomed quietly, cautiously, in the spaces left unguarded by duty. A shared glance over the grain sacks. A hand that lingered a little too long during market trade. A song sung a bit too softly, but meant for one set of ears only. Love, when it came, had to be clever. It slipped between arranged vows and public expectations. It lived in small acts, saving the ripest plum for someone, walking the long way home just for the chance to pass their cottage window. It was fragile and often fleeting, but when it sparked, it meant something. Because in a world where everything about marriage was negotiated, calculated, and surveilled, affection became rebellion. Kindness was daring. And desire? That was its own kind of quiet defiance. While troubadour songs may have exaggerated the passion, they weren't entirely wrong. Love in the Middle Ages wasn't absent, it was just hidden, pressed like a wildflower between pages of duty. And if you were lucky enough to find it, you held on with both hands. Carefully, quietly, and sometimes, against all odds, forever. A fine or a very disappointed father with a pitchfork. Let's clear up one of the most persistent legends about medieval relationships. Chastity belts. Yes, you've probably seen them in cartoons, historical dramas, or very unfortunate museum gift shops. Those iron contraptions allegedly locked around a woman's waist while her husband went off to war, leaving her physically and morally sealed. Except not really. There's no solid historical evidence that chastity belts were ever widely used in the Middle Ages. In fact, most examples we have today come from the Renaissance or even the Victorian era, periods more obsessed with the idea of medieval repression than with what actually happened. Many of these belts were created as joke items, warnings, or museum curiosities, not functioning devices. Medieval manuscripts, which often record all sorts of uncomfortable details, are suspiciously silent about mass belt distribution. No tailor advertised them. No laws regulated them. No churches handed them out during awkward marriage ceremonies. It's almost as if, and stay with me here, they weren't actually a thing, which makes sense because the design is wildly impractical. Medieval hygiene was already questionable. Now, imagine adding a rusty metal contraption with no user manual and a padlock that probably required a blacksmith. It would have caused more infections than it prevented indiscretions. So, where did the myth come from? Likely from a combination of later moral panic and satire. Renaissance moralists and Victorian collectors loved the image of a repressed, over-controlled medieval woman. It fit their narrative, and nothing says virtue like a literal keyhole in your underpants. In reality, fidelity was enforced through more traditional and more effective means: shame, surveillance, religion, and strategic matchmaking. Noble women were often chaperoned within an inch of their lives. Peasant girls had entire villages watching them like unpaid private investigators, and any whiff of scandal could lead to ruined reputations, lost dowries, or awkward confessions involving phrases like "at the edge of the barley field." In a surprising twist that would shock many of their modern descendants, medieval towns didn't just tolerate brothel. In many cases, they regulated them. That's right. In several parts of medieval Europe, especially urban centers, brothel operated as legal businesses. Town councils licensed them, charged taxes, and even designated specific red light districts long before the light bulb was invented. Some cities went as far as employing officials to manage them. These lucky souls were known as brothel keepers, or more colorfully, keepers of public women, which sounds like a very stressful line on a resume. The rationale behind this arrangement was pragmatic, if a little cynical. Officials believed that allowing a controlled outlet for men's desires would reduce the chances of greater sins like adultery, assault, or heaven forbid, dancing. Regulated brothel were seen as a necessary evil to keep society orderly, much like traffic signs or the existence of turnips. The church, of course, wasn't thrilled. Officially, it condemned the entire practice, but unofficially, many clergy turned a blind eye. Some even collected rent from the very same establishments. If that sounds like hypocrisy, congratulations. You've grasped the essence of medieval theology and practice. Working in a brothel was no fairy tale, but it wasn't necessarily a life of constant misery either. Some women chose the profession for economic reasons, especially widows or those without family support. Others were coerced or trafficked, particularly in port cities, where sailors brought in coin and complications in equal measure. There were even handbooks, yes, actual handbooks, for how these houses should be managed. Clean sheets, basic health inspections, and set hours were all part of the regulation process. Patrons came from all social classes: knights, apprentices, merchants, even monks, despite vows that strongly suggested otherwise. Entry fees varied, services were cataloged, and in some cases, customers paid in eggs, wool, or whatever awkward barter they had on hand. Medieval tinder, it was not. Let's set the scene. Candlelight flickering, a soft breeze through the thatched roof. Your beloved whispers, sweet nothings, and then removes their wool tunic to reveal a powerful medieval musk. Because when it came to personal hygiene, medieval Europe had priorities. Staying clean was on the list, just somewhere after surviving the plague, fixing the roof, and catching the pig that got into the pantry again. Bathing did happen, but not nearly as often as modern noses would hope. Peasants bathed infrequently, maybe once a month, more if they fell into a river by accident. Soap was either homemade or imported, expensive, and used sparingly. And while public bathhouses existed in towns and cities, they were sometimes banned during outbreaks of disease or scandal or both. If you were wealthy, you had options. A hot bath could be drawn, scented with herbs, and followed by being rubbed with linen cloths by attendants. If you were poor, your sponge bath involved a cold bucket and the vague hope that nobody would notice your aroma over the stables. To add complexity, water itself was occasionally viewed with suspicion, especially cold water. Some believed bathing too frequently could weaken the body or open the skin to illness. Others simply didn't have the time or the tub or any water that wasn't already being fought over by the local geese. Now, imagine trying to impress someone under these conditions. Perfume, mostly for the elite. Deodorant, a dream of the distant future. Dental care, well, you might rub your teeth with ash or chew mint leaves if you were fancy. Kissing was certainly an adventure. Clothing didn't help. Layers of wool, leather, linen, and fur trapped heat, sweat, and every scent you encountered during your day, including the contents of the chamber pot and the mystery stew. And yet people still found ways to fall in love, flirt, and get close. Perhaps our standards were different. Or perhaps when everyone smelled equally awful, love was truly blind and nose blind. In medieval Europe, controlling the size of your family was a bit like trying to steer a cart with no wheels, no reins, and a particularly uncooperative goat. Technically possible, but not something you could count on. To be clear, people did try. Just because contraception wasn't effective by modern standards didn't mean medieval folks were oblivious. They were very much aware that certain behaviors led to babies, and many went to elaborate, if occasionally baffling, lengths to prevent it. Some of the more scientific methods included herbal mixtures, animal membranes, and rituals that involved burying certain objects near the doorstep. One popular approach advised drinking wine boiled with beaver testicles. Others recommended wearing amulets blessed by someone who hopefully wasn't guessing. A few guides even claimed jumping up and down vigorously after intimacy would help, which if nothing else, probably burned some calories. There were also early versions of barrier methods, though calling them reliable would be generous. Linen soaked in various concoctions was one approach. A few brave souls tried wax, and there are scattered references to, let's call them medieval prototypes of what would later become familiar latex devices. But don't ask how they were made. You really don't want to know. The church, of course, was not amused. Any attempt to avoid conception was often labeled sinful or unnatural. Procreation was the stated goal of marriage, and anything that got in the way of that divine mission was frowned upon, or more commonly denounced loudly from the pulpit. Still, not everyone followed church guidance. Among married couples, particularly those struggling with poverty, the desire to space out pregnancies or avoid another mouth to feed was very real. And among unmarried couples, let's just say the motivation was even stronger. But no matter the method, reliability was low. Birth control, such as it was, depended on folk wisdom, local herbs, and a surprising amount of hope. And when it failed, which it often did, well, that's where hasty marriages, hidden pregnancies, and a lot of awkward conversations came in. Despite what church authorities like to pretend, not every medieval couple waited until the wedding bells rang before getting cozy. In fact, the practice of testing the goods before marriage was, well, common enough to require a lot of paperwork, known as fornication in church records and getting ahead of yourself in everyday village gossip. Intimacy before marriage wasn't exactly rare, but it was definitely monitored. In towns and parishes across Europe, local officials kept moral rolls, which were less like diaries and more like ledgers of shame. If a couple was caught or even suspected of jumping the marital timeline, they could be hauled before the local court and fined. Sometimes the fine went to the church, sometimes to the town, and occasionally to someone who claimed to have witnessed the event. Medieval snitching was alive and well. Fines varied depending on whether it was a first offense, whether a pregnancy resulted, or whether the couple eventually got married. In some cases, getting married after the fact erased the fine, kind of like retroactive permission. In others, the fine was still applied, but at a discounted rate. Early bird penalties, if you will. And let's not forget the social consequences. In tight-knit communities, everyone knew everyone else's business. So, even if your local priest was feeling merciful, your neighbors weren't. Gossip could spread faster than a poorly stored meat pie in July. Interestingly, many of these situations resulted in something called handfasting, a sort of informal engagement where the couple considered themselves betrothed, and in some regions that was legally enough to begin cohabiting. The church later tried to tighten that loophole, but in the meantime, a lot of medieval babies were technically early arrivals. Among peasants, this was all handled with a bit more practicality. If a couple was clearly serious and a pregnancy had occurred, marriage usually followed, sometimes hurried along with a gentle nudge or firm push from both families. Among nobles, however, consequences could be far worse, especially if inheritance or reputation was on the line. In the medieval world, virginity wasn't just a virtue. It was a contract clause, a political tool, and occasionally a community-wide obsession. Among the peasantry, expectations varied by region and circumstance. A young woman was generally expected to arrive at marriage untested, at least officially. But if she didn't, well, some eyebrows would rise, and a small fine or shotgun wedding might sort things out. For the upper classes, though, things got serious. Noble women's virginity was directly tied to inheritance, alliances, and family honor. A broken engagement might spark a feud. A pregnancy out of wedlock could derail generations of planning. So how did they verify it? Well, badly. Sometimes it came down to vague testimony and character references. She seemed virtuous, or she avoided the stable boy mostly. Other times, more invasive methods were used, like midwives or matrons inspecting for the infamous hymen, which science has since confirmed is not in fact a medieval chastity barometer. But that didn't stop anyone. There were also attempts to prove virginity after the wedding, such as displaying a bloodstained sheet, like a very awkward medieval Yelp review. This tradition, while not universal, was expected in certain regions, and if the sheet stayed clean, cue lawsuits, annulments, and family drama on a scale rivaling a royal soap opera. Men, of course, were under no such scrutiny. Male virginity was considered an optional bonus. A future husband's experience level was rarely questioned. At most, he might be encouraged to avoid tavern maids or loose company. but no one was checking his laundry the next morning. Virginity was also linked to religious symbolism. Maidens were often praised as pure vessels, which is beautiful in theory and incredibly uncomfortable in practice. Young girls were raised with saintly ideals, often featuring horrifying martyrdom stories. And if a marriage was annulled on the grounds that a bride had been dishonest, it didn't just ruin her, it could drag down her entire family's honor and property claims. So yes, in medieval Europe, virginity wasn't just about morality. It was legal currency. If you're wondering whether same-sex attraction existed in medieval times, the answer is a resounding yes. Human nature didn't start in the 20th century. But if you're wondering whether it was openly accepted, that's where things get complicated. Medieval society was structured around religious doctrine, social roles, and property rights. And all three had a lot to say about who could love whom. Spoiler alert, it was usually a man and a woman within marriage, preferably for the purpose of making more villagers. Officially, same-sex intimacy was labeled a sin by the church, often lumped in with other unnatural acts like dancing on feast days or reading too many books. Punishments varied wildly depending on region, time period, and who was involved. A peasant couple might get a scolding and penance. Nobles, they might face exile or quietly be ignored if they had enough land. But while the church thundered from the pulpit, real life was messier. We have records, poems, letters, even legal documents that show emotional, romantic, and sometimes physical relationships between people of the same sex. Some monks wrote love letters to each other in Latin that sound suspiciously less brotherly and more longing. Noble women sometimes shared beds and declared exclusive devotion in terms that would make a troubadour blush. Medieval Europe also had social structures that blurred lines. All-male monasteries and all-female convents created deep emotional bonds. Knightly brotherhoods were full of vows and affectionate language. Some historians debate whether these were romantic, platonic, or something in between. But either way, there were feelings involved and possibly poetry. As for terminology, the modern concept of sexual identity didn't exist. You didn't come out. You just lived carefully, quietly, and often coded in allegory. There were no pride parades, but there were songs, saints' stories, and suspiciously intense pilgrimages taken in pairs. Adultery in medieval Europe was a bit like handling a live chicken while juggling knives. Risky, loud, and likely to end with someone losing a bit of pride or property. Let's be clear, adultery wasn't just a personal failing. It was a social offense. Marriage was seen not only as a holy sacrament, but also a legal contract, a property deal, and often a strategic alliance. So when someone strayed, they weren't just breaking hearts. They were tampering with inheritances, dowies, and the always fragile local gossip equilibrium. For women, the stakes were significantly higher. A married woman caught in an affair could face public shaming, loss of dowry rights, forced penance, or even exile, especially if she had the audacity to get caught with evidence. Adulterous noble women might find themselves imprisoned, divorced, or in extreme cases discreetly removed from court life. Think less scarlet letter, more scarlet exit. Men, on the other hand, got more leeway. A married man having an affair with an unmarried woman might be seen as morally suspect, but not legally punished, unless the woman's family had powerful friends or the church was feeling unusually righteous that week. That said, not all adulterers got off easy. Some towns imposed steep fines or required public confession. A few legal records include creative punishments such as parading through the village in nothing but a shift or having to pay for a new church bell because nothing says divine justice like bronze acoustics. The real danger, however, wasn't always the law. It was the husband. Honor killings weren't unheard of, particularly among nobles. If a cuckold man discovered his wife's affair, medieval customs sometimes allowed him to take appropriate action. The definition of appropriate, of course, depended heavily on his status and how many swords he owned. For the wealthy, things could spiral into full-blown scandals, jewels, annulments, or decadal-long family feuds. For peasants, the consequences were usually financial. A fine here, a goat forfeited there, and a permanent place in village gossip. In medieval Europe, the idea of consent existed, but not in the way we understand it today. It wasn't about mutual respect or enthusiastic yes. Instead, it was tangled in law codes, dowies, church doctrine, and the occasional shrug from society. Let's start with the basics. Medieval canon law did recognize the concept of consent in marriage. In fact, a marriage was considered valid if both parties verbally consented, even without a priest present. That's right. Two people saying "I will" in a field somewhere could technically be married. Romantic, possibly legally confusing. Absolutely. But here's the rub. Just because consent was acknowledged in theory doesn't mean it was respected in practice, especially for women. For noble daughters, consent often came after arrangements were made. Families negotiated marriages like peace treaties. The young lady's opinion might be politely requested or strongly implied, but in the end, the dowry talked louder than she did. For peasant women, choices were broader, but still pressured. Saying no to a match could mean economic ruin or social backlash. Saying no to the local reeve's son riskier still. Inside marriage, consent became even murkier. Husbands had legal rights to their wives' bodies, and denying them could be grounds for complaint or annulment. Some church thinkers argued that spouses owed each other the marital debt, which sounds like a joint checking account, but was actually far less voluntary. Still, the picture wasn't all grim. Medieval courts did prosecute cases of coercion and assault, especially when witnesses were available or the accused didn't have powerful friends. In urban centers like London or Paris, court records show women and men bringing forward complaints, sometimes winning justice or at least making a public stink. And let's not forget the literary side. Medieval tales are full of complex dynamics. Courtly love poetry, for example, often danced around consent with knights pining, ladies refusing, and everyone dramatically swooning. If nothing else, they knew it was important to ask, even if they ignored the answer. If you ever felt like the medieval church had a complicated relationship with physical pleasure, you're right. It wasn't just complicated, it was borderline suspicious. And that suspicion extended right into the bedroom of every married couple where the church preferred ideally that nothing too enjoyable was going on. To be fair, the church didn't outright ban marital relations. That would have been a logistical nightmare for inheritance, population, and, well, humanity. But it did strongly recommend moderation, extreme moderation, like once a month in the dark, no smiling kind of moderation. Theologians of the time praised celibacy as the highest form of spiritual discipline. Saints were celibate. Monks and nuns took vows. Even married couples were encouraged to live in continence, abstaining entirely, especially if they were older, holier, or simply tired of each other. A couple who voluntarily gave up intimacy was praised as being halfway to sainthood, or at least halfway to separate beds. Some church thinkers like St. Jerome went even further. He argued that even within marriage, desire was a weakness. Marital relations were acceptable only for procreation, not for fun, not for bonding, and certainly not because someone looked particularly fetching in their woolen nightshirt. This attitude filtered down into confessionals and moral manuals. Priests were instructed to ask married parishioners if they had been too lustful, even with their own spouses. Picture the awkward silence that must have followed that question at the altar rail. And yet people still lived their lives. Most peasants, merchants, and even nobles nodded politely at the church's teachings, then went home and did whatever felt right between chores, taxes, and the odd peasant uprising. Let's be honest, after a long day threshing barley or settling land disputes, a little affection probably felt more comforting than shameful. But for the truly devout, celibate marriages were held up as models of spiritual partnership. These were couples who lived together, prayed together, and considered carnal urges a thing of the past, or at least a thing better left to younger, less holy villages. After everything we've covered, arranged marriages, fines for flirting, herbal birth control, suspicious bath habits, and church warnings against smiling too much, you might be wondering, did medieval people actually fall in love? The answer is yes, awkwardly, passionately, and sometimes even happily. Despite the rigid social structures and moral sermons, love found a way to bloom in the cracks. Peasant couples courted in fields and marketplaces, trading favors, flowers, and whispered gossip over turnips. Noble lovers exchanged poetry and secret glances during formal banquets while pretending to care about hunting falcon breeds. Monks and nuns wrote letters filled with emotion that modern readers still debate. Was it spiritual longing or something more? Literature from the period is bursting with romance. Troubadours sang of distant ladies who inspired knights to go off and get very dramatically injured. Stories of courtly love glorified longing from afar, especially if you were pining for someone married to your boss. Sure, the love was often unattainable, but hey, that's where the best verses come from. In some cases, couples genuinely married for love. Records survive of peasants who eloped or refused matches arranged 00:35:06 by their parents. Even nobles occasionally rebelled, much to the horror of their family accountants. The church, interestingly enough, actually required verbal consent from both bride and groom, even if that consent was delivered through gritted teeth while holding a goose as dowry collateral. And once married, many couples built strong partnerships. They worked side by side, raised children, endured plagues, and navigated taxes, which is basically the medieval version of a romantic getaway. Letters between spouses, especially during times of separation, show real affection, real longing, real commitment. Even widows and widowers sometimes remarried for companionship rather than political gain, choosing someone they like to spend their remaining years with. Because even after everything, the rules, the risk, the ritual, people still wanted to feel loved, preferably before curfew, and hopefully not during Lent. It all began with a disaster. Zeno of Citium, a wealthy merchant from the island of Cyprus, had it all. Ships loaded with precious dyes, trade routes mapped across the Mediterranean, and the kind of fortune that made a man feel invincible. But fate, as ancient philosophers love to remind us, doesn't care how many ships you own. Somewhere near Athens, Zeno's fleet was caught in a violent storm. The sea didn't just swallow his cargo, it swallowed his identity. One moment he was a merchant, the next a man with nothing. When he finally reached the Athenian shore, he was broke, soaked, and ironically on the verge of something far more enduring than trade wealth. With nowhere to go and nothing left to lose, Zeno wandered into a small bookshop in the Athenian agora. It was here that he picked up a worn copy of Xenophon's Memorabilia, a text that preserved the wisdom of Socrates. Intrigued by the quiet power of the ideas within, Zeno asked the bookseller where he could find a man like Socrates. The bookseller simply pointed to a stooped, cranky philosopher named Crates walking by. And so Zeno began studying Underrates the Cynic, a man known for rejecting wealth and possessions with almost theatrical dedication. He once threw his money into the sea just to prove a point. At first, Zeno struggled with this extreme lifestyle. He wasn't ready to live in poverty for philosophy's sake. But Crates planted a seed in his mind, one that grew into a new way of thinking. Zeno didn't stay a student forever. Over time, he pieced together his own worldview, borrowing Socratic ethics, Cynic discipline, and the logical rigor of earlier thinkers like Heraclitus. Eventually, he began teaching in the painted colonnade of Athens, the Stoa Puceal, a public porch decorated with murals. That's where Stoicism got its name, not from an ivory tower or secret academy, but from a painted porch open to all. It's a fitting origin, a philosophy born not from luxury, but from ruin. not in a palace, but in a moment of humility. Stoicism from its first breath was designed to help people navigate the wreckage, not avoid it. And Zeno was its first survivor. After the shipwreck and the scrolls, after the quiet conversations with cynics and the long walks under the Athenian sun, Zeno didn't just start teaching. He started redefining what it meant to live well. At the heart of his philosophy was one powerful idea: logos. To the Stoics, logos wasn't just reason. It was the divine, rational structure of the universe, the cosmic blueprint. Everything they believed happened for a reason, whether or not humans could understand it. The world, messy as it seemed, was ordered. And if you could align your thinking with that cosmic order, you could live with peace, clarity, and moral strength. Zeno and his early followers taught that virtue, a right in Greek, was the only true good. Not fame, not wealth, not even physical health. Those were indifferents, things that might be nice to have, but didn't define your moral worth. What mattered was how you handled them. And that's where the Stoic mindset takes shape. The world throws chaos at you, but you remain unmoved. Not emotionless, but anchored. You can't control external events. You can't control what people say or do. But you can always control your thoughts, your actions, and your responses. It was radical. Most people back then, and let's be honest, most people today, chase comfort, admiration, money, or control. But Stoicism offered a quieter path. Live in harmony with nature. Accept fate without resentment, and strive only to be good, not to feel good. Their favorite analogy: life is like being a dog tied to a cart. You can either run with it or be dragged behind. Either way, the cart's going forward. Your choice is how you move with it. Zeno wasn't alone for long. His students began gathering in the Stoa, discussing how to master themselves rather than the world. Over time, this porch talk turned into one of the most quietly resilient philosophies in history, and one that would outlast empires. But philosophy doesn't live in theory. It lives in practice. And in the next generation, a new Stoic would take the reins. One who fought battles not with logic alone, but with discipline and steel. His name Cleanthes, a former boxer who brought muscle to the mind. Cleanthes wasn't your typical philosopher. Before he ever scribbled a single scroll or stood beneath the painted porch, he was a boxer. Not metaphorically, a literal pugilist earning his bread through sheer physical strength and relentless endurance. But when he discovered Zeno's teachings, he found a different kind of strength. The kind that didn't bruise, but braced the soul. He worked by night carrying water for a gardener and studied philosophy by day. His hands were calloused, his muscles worn, but his mind unshakable. Cleanthes embodied the Stoic belief that virtue comes not from privilege, but from perseverance. He didn't speak of theories he hadn't tested. If Zeno taught that one should accept hardship with grace, Cleanthes lived it every sunrise. His most famous work, the Hymn to Zeus, is a poetic tribute to Logos, the divine rationality that governs all things. But don't let the title fool you. This wasn't religious flattery. It was a calm declaration of cosmic order. Everything, Cleanthes wrote, is woven into a grand plan, even the painful parts. His Stoicism was like a glacier, silent, immense, and impossible to move. He also introduced a more emotional texture to Stoicism. While Zeno emphasized logic and detachment, Cleanthes suggested that proper emotions like awe at nature or love for wisdom could have a place if they aligned with reason. He wasn't arguing for indulgence, just for balance. After all, what good is a philosophy that turns you into a robot? Cleanthes wasn't flashy, and he didn't gather crowds with clever wordplay. In fact, some mocked him for being slow of speech. But what he lacked in eloquence, he made up for in steadiness. And in Stoicism, steadiness was everything. He eventually succeeded Zeno as head of the Stoic school, not because he was charismatic, but because he lived the philosophy more fully than anyone else. His life was a kind of walking proof, a quiet testament that one could endure hardship without bitterness, question fate without rage, and remain grounded without giving up on greatness. Through Klenth, Stoicism gained muscle. Not the kind that wins applause, but the kind that holds your spine straight when the world goes sideways. And then came a man who sharpened Stoicism like a blade. Chrysippus, the logician who turned this porch-born philosophy into a towering system of thought. If Zeno founded Stoicism and Cleanthes gave it strength, Chrysippus gave it its skeleton. Without him, Stoicism might have crumbled into vague ideas and forgotten porch lectures. Instead, it became one of the most rigorous philosophical systems in the ancient world, thanks to a man who reportedly wrote over 700 books. Most of them now lost, but their influence undeniable. Chrysippus was relentless. He didn't just inherit the school from Cleanthes, he rebuilt it. Where Zeno had been reserved and Klenth poetic, Chrysippus was surgical. His specialty, logic. In a time when most philosophers leaned on rhetoric or emotional appeal, Chrysippus built a system of reasoning that could rival Aristotle's. He was obsessed with clarity. He believed that if Stoicism was to survive, it couldn't rely on charisma or tradition. It had to make sense, ironclad, no loopholes, no fluff. He refined the Stoic distinction between what is in our control and what is not. He expanded their ethics, metaphysics, and physics into something coherent and unapologetically difficult. Chrysippus argued that virtue alone was sufficient for happiness, not virtue plus comfort or virtue plus friends. Just virtue, full stop. One of his most famous contributions was the lekton, a concept describing the meaning behind words. He argued that every spoken word had a sayable, a layer of content carried by speech tied to logic. It might sound abstract, but this deepened the Stoic understanding of reason and clarity, which for them was essential to a good life. But he wasn't just dry parchment and dusty scrolls. Chrysippus had a biting wit. Once when accused of not practicing what he preached, he supposedly replied, "Would you blame a doctor who gets sick? He still knows how to treat illness." Stoicism wasn't about pretending to be perfect. It was about trying every single day to close the gap between your actions and your ideals. Thanks to Chrysippus, Stoicism hardened. It became more than a comfort for shipwrecked merchants or poetic boxes. It became a discipline, something you studied, practiced, and used to cut through confusion and chaos. And that discipline would soon find its way out of Greece into the heart of Rome, where emperors and slaves alike would grapple with its power. By the time Stoicism drifted into Rome, the philosophy had already weathered centuries of refinement. But in the hands of the Romans, it evolved from a Greek intellectual pursuit into a way of life suited for statesmen, generals, and even emperors. The Romans weren't interested in abstract metaphysics or syllogisms about lecture. They wanted practicality. They faced wars, conspiracies, betrayal, and personal ruin. And they needed a system that could hold their inner world steady while the outer world collapsed. Stoicism, with its focus on self-mastery and virtue in the face of chaos, was a perfect fit. Enter Seneca the Younger, philosopher, playwright, and reluctant advisor to the notoriously unstable Emperor Nero. Seneca wasn't born into hardship. He was a wealthy elite, well-educated, and dangerously close to power. But despite his position, his writings reveal a man deeply aware of life's fragility and the corrupting lure of comfort. In his letters to Lucilius, Seneca preached restraint, mindfulness, and simplicity. He warned against being ruled by emotion or desire. And yet his own life was a battlefield between Stoic ideals and political compromise. He amassed wealth even as he wrote about frugality. He served a tyrant even while writing about virtue. But rather than discredit him, this tension makes him more relatable. Seneca didn't pose as a saint. He was painfully aware of his contradictions. His advice to others often came with a quiet self-rebuke. "I am not a wise man," he wrote, "but a lover of wisdom." And maybe that's the most Stoic thing of all, not to claim mastery, but to pursue it humbly. While Seneca offered Stoicism to the elite, another Roman gave it to everyone else. Epictetus, a former slave, crippled and impoverished. Epictetus owned nothing, not even himself. And yet he taught that true freedom comes from within. "You may chain my leg," he said, "but not even Zeus can conquer my mind." To him, life's hardships weren't obstacles. They were training grounds for virtue. His teachings, preserved by his student, Arrian, became a Stoic manual for inner liberation. In Rome, Stoicism was no longer just philosophy. It was armor, mental armor. And soon that armor would be worn by the man who ruled the known world, Marcus Aurelius, emperor, warrior, and the most unlikely of all, a philosopher king. It's one thing to read philosophy in peace. It's another to write it on the front lines of war while ruling an empire crumbling at its edges. Marcus Aurelius, crowned emperor of Rome in 161 CE, was a man born into unimaginable privilege. And yet, his reign was anything but comfortable. Plagues swept across the empire. Germanic tribes pushed at the borders. His co-emperor Lucius Verus died early. His generals betrayed him. And worst of all, his own son, Commodus, would grow into the tyrant he had hoped never to raise. Amid all this, Marcus didn't write speeches or propaganda. He wrote to himself, quiet personal reflections later compiled into the Meditations. Never intended for publication, these pages offer a window into a Stoic mind under siege. They read not like declarations from a throne, but like whispered reminders from a tired man trying to stay upright. "Begin each day by telling yourself," he wrote, "today I shall meet with interference, ingratitude, insolence, disloyalty, ill will, and selfishness." That wasn't pessimism. It was preparation. Marcus believed that by expecting hardship, he could face it without being thrown off course. To him, people's actions were not insults. They were reflections of their ignorance. And his duty wasn't to control others, but to control himself. He often reminded himself, "You could die tomorrow, you could die today. So act now, not with anxiety, but with purpose." That wasn't despair. That was clarity. Despite commanding legions and managing a vast empire, Marcus was obsessed with inner life. He believed you could be surrounded by chaos and still remain untouched if your mind stayed anchored in reason and virtue. He rarely indulged in cruelty. He rejected opulence. And while he couldn't always live up to Stoic ideals, who could? He returned to them like a compass in a storm. Marcus Aurelius didn't invent Stoicism, but in many ways, he lived it more visibly than anyone before him. He proved that Stoicism wasn't just for philosophers in toes or aesthetic monks. It was for anyone, even the most powerful man on earth, who wanted to carry peace into the battlefield of life. And yet, after Marcus, the flame of Stoicism began to flicker. It wouldn't vanish, but it would retreat, waiting centuries to be rediscovered by new seekers of calm in the modern world. After the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 CE, Stoicism didn't exactly die, but it faded. The philosophy that had once stood at the heart of Roman intellectual life began to slip quietly into the background. Part of this had to do with politics. Marcus's son, Commodus, inherited the empire and seemed determined to undo every Stoic virtue his father lived by. While Marcus embodied restraint and wisdom, Commodus embodied indulgence and vanity. The Roman court became a theater of excess, and philosophy had no role in the spectacle. Meanwhile, a new force was rising, Christianity. As it spread through the Roman Empire and eventually became state religion, its theology, rituals, and worldview began to replace the ancient schools. Where Stoicism taught self-reliance, Christianity emphasized divine grace. Where Stoicism taught acceptance of fate, Christianity spoke of redemption and the will of God. Though these ideas weren't always in conflict, Christian thinkers often saw Stoicism as a noble but ultimately pagan system, admirable yet incomplete. And yet, Stoicism didn't vanish. It simply migrated, its core ideas seeping into early Christian thought. Many church fathers admired the Stoics. Thinkers like Augustine, though critical of Stoic pride, respected their moral seriousness. And monastic traditions, especially among Christian ascetics, borrowed heavily from Stoic discipline. Silence, simplicity, denial of luxury, and the examination of conscience. All of these would have felt right at home in the writings of Epictetus or Seneca. Throughout the medieval period, Stoicism became a sort of background philosophy, respected by scholars, cited by monks, but rarely practiced in full. It was no longer a public movement or a street-side school. It was a whisper in the margins, kept alive by scribes, theologians, and the occasional curious mind. But survival is sometimes stronger than success. Stoicism's quiet endurance meant that when the intellectual winds shifted centuries later during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, its ideas would be ready to return. For all its decline, Stoicism had left seeds buried in the soil of Western thought. And when people once again sought clarity, purpose, and strength without illusion, those seeds would bloom. And one day they'd even show up in places no ancient philosopher could have imagined. In self-help books, leadership seminars, and yes, on your favorite podcast. Stoicism's comeback didn't arrive with a scroll in hand. It came through blogs, books, and podcasts. After centuries of quiet endurance, Stoicism re-emerged in the digital age not as dusty philosophy, but as quiet armor for a world cracking under noise, pressure, and distraction. In a culture that rewards constant reaction and endless striving, Stoicism offered something deeply countercultural: the permission to pause. What began on the porches of ancient Greece found its way into bestsellers, podcasts, and morning routines. Writers like Ryan Holiday made it accessible, translating the words of Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus into modern life guides. Whether you're launching a company, raising a family, or just getting through a Monday, their wisdom still speaks, and it's not just about high performance. In an anxious, fast-moving world, Stoicism has become a kind of refuge, a philosophy for uncertain times. Even mental health professionals took notice, finding echoes of Stoic thinking in cognitive behavioral therapy. Question your thoughts, focus on what you control, and respond with intention. But the revival hasn't gone unchallenged. Critics point out how modern Stoicism can sometimes feel like motivational wallpaper stripped of nuance, repurposed for hustle culture. And they're not wrong. The ancient version was more demanding, more humble, less about control, and more about character. Still, it survives not because it's trendy, but because it works. When the world tilts, when a job is lost, a relationship breaks, or uncertainty creeps in, Stoicism doesn't promise escape. It offers steadiness, a reminder that you may not choose your circumstances, but you always choose your response in that way. It's not a retreat from life, but a return to it with clarity, with calm, with grace. Today, in a world obsessed with noise, Stoicism is a quiet rebellion. Not loud, not angry, just steady. A discipline that whispers, breathe first, then act. And maybe, in this century as in the last, that's still the most radical thing of all. The courage to stay kind in a cruel moment. The humility to know you're not the center of the universe, but you are responsible for how you move through it. More than ever, people are returning to this simple clarity. Athletes use it to manage pressure. Veterans use it to process trauma. CEOs use it to lead without ego. Teenagers, overwhelmed by the constant flood of comparison and digital noise, turn to Epictetus for a lifeline. Of course, no philosophy is a magic cure. You'll still feel grief, still fail, still lose your temper. But Stoicism gives you something rare: a framework to get back up, reflect, and re-enter. In the end, it's not about being perfect. It's about progress. Quiet, steady, internal progress. And in a world that rewards loudness, maybe the most revolutionary act is to be still. To a modern visitor, an ancient Roman bath might look like a luxury resort. Marble floors, veined ceilings, statues of gods, and pools steaming in the morning sun. But to a Roman, it was just another Tuesday. Bathing wasn't an occasional treat. It was a daily ritual, and for many, an essential part of being Roman. By the height of the empire, there were over 900 public baths in Rome alone, ranging from grand imperial complexes to modest neighborhood facilities. Everyone from senators to shoemakers made time to bathe. Cleanliness was important, yes, but so was the rhythm of the experience, the routine, the conversation, the heat. The process was deliberate. You'd enter through the apoditarium or changing room, where slaves might help wealthier patrons undress. From there, you'd ease into the tepidarium, a warm room that opened your paws and began the relaxation. Then came the colarium, the heart of the experience. A hot, steamy chamber heated by an underfloor system called the hippic. Here bathers would sweat, scrape their skin with stridles, curved metal tools, and sometimes even get a massage. Finally, you'd plunge into the frigidarium, a cold pool meant to tighten the skin and jolt the senses. It was this contrast, hot to cold, sweat to chill, that gave the ritual its power. Romans believed it was good for circulation, digestion, and even mood. And honestly, they were probably right. But more than hygiene or health, baths were about belonging. You went to see and be seen. You gossiped, worked, debated politics, made business deals, or just eavesdropped on the latest scandal. Some brought their own musicians. Others brought snacks. Poets recited verses. Philosophers argued under domed ceilings echoing with laughter and steam. In essence, a Roman bath was a democratic space, at least by Roman standards. Status mattered, but even emperors might share a room with commoners. Slaves and women had restricted access or separate hours, but they too were part of this daily world. For the Romans, bathing wasn't about vanity. It was about routine, health, society, and rhythm. A place where the individual dissolved just a bit into the larger hum of the empire, one breath of steam at a time. Roman baths weren't just impressive. They were engineering masterpieces. Long before the modern sauna or heated flooring, the Romans figured out how to transform bricks, fire, and water into an immersive wellness center. At the core of this innovation was the hippic system, an early form of central heating. Beneath the floors of the hot rooms, slaves stoked a roaring furnace or perfernium. This fire heated a space beneath the raised floor supported by small columns called pli. Hot air flowed through this subfloor chamber and up through flue in the walls, radiating heat through the room like a gentle oven. Roman baths weren't just marvels of architecture, they were masterclasses in engineering, comfort, and cultural integration. Vaulted ceilings trapped heat, domes softened sound, and a sequence of rooms moved bathers from cool to scorching, regulating temperature with purpose. Aqueducts, the silent heroes of the empire, supplied endless water, enabling even inland cities to host massive bath complexes like those at Caracalla. The system was gravity-fed, remarkably efficient, and tied into an urban network that included sewage and drainage. Maintaining these complexes took an army of workers heating furnaces, scrubbing pools, and repairing plumbing. But the reward was a seamless experience of warmth, flow, and public life. No electricity, no machines, just brilliance in stone. Yet Roman baths weren't only about hygiene. They were a social engine, open-air newsrooms, and political arenas. Gossip flowed freely. Senators, merchants, and poets mingled nude, steam blurring status. Business deals were made. Philosophers debated. Even emperors like Hadrian used their presence in public baths as strategic statements. I'm one of you. Kind of. In this steamy setting, the real empire whispered its plans. Baths were where wellness met statecraft. Hot rooms opened pores and relaxed muscles. Cold plunges invigorated. Skin was scraped clean with strigils, and massages followed with scented or herbal oils. It wasn't spa day, it was daily ritual, endorsed by doctors, the military, and philosophers alike. Many large baths even had medical clinics, where Greek-trained physicians offered treatments and dietary advice. A cough or ache might earn you a new bathing routine, not a pill. Attached gymnasiums encouraged exercise wrestling, boxing, fencing, or ball games before the first drop of water ever touched skin. To the Romans, the bath wasn't indulgence. It was discipline, cleansing, calming, and connecting one plunge at a time. The idea was to work up a sweat before entering the steam rooms. Health wasn't passive. It was earned, one push-up and plunge at a time. Even mental health wasn't ignored. The rhythm of the bath, its slow, deliberate transitions from room to room, encouraged reflection. Some Stoics and Epicureans even wrote about the baths as places to clear the mind and tame the emotions. In many ways, Roman baths were ahead of their time, an integrated space for exercise, cleansing, socializing, and healing. A kind of ancient wellness center with better mosaics and slightly more gossip. For the Romans, a healthy body wasn't a goal. It was the foundation of virtue, clarity, and strength. And the bathhouse was where it all began. Walking into a grand Roman bathhouse wasn't just stepping into a building. It was stepping into an aesthetic experience. The architecture, the materials, the very air, everything was designed to impress, soothe, and elevate. From the moment you entered the apoditerium changing room, you were surrounded by elegance. The walls were often painted in vivid frescoes, mythological scenes, pastoral landscapes, or even cheeky caricatures. Marble benches lined the room, niches held clothing, and on the better days, musicians played softly in the background while your sandals were taken by a servant. Then came the baths themselves. The tepidarium was usually the most beautiful room, designed as a kind of warm antechamber to the hotter and colder extremes. It was often circular or rectangular with high vate ceilings, colorful mosaics on the floors, and large windows that diffused the afternoon light. The ceilings were sometimes coffered or domed, supported by columns of Egyptian granite or local stone. The colarium, the hot room, featured heated pools and steam. You'd see bronze or terracotta braziers and sometimes gilded taps that flowed with heated water. The floors were warm beneath your feet thanks to the HIPPIC system, and the air shimmered with heat. Decorative fountains and statues added a touch of divine elegance. Apollo, Venus, and Hercules all made appearances. The frigidarium, cool, grand, and serene, was often the largest and most impressive space in a Roman bath. Its cold pool reflected ceilings painted with stars or geometric patterns, lit by beams of sunlight through oculi overhead. Quiet and still, it stood in contrast to the busy chatter of warmer rooms. Everything, from imported marble to clever geometry, was designed to awe and to remind bathers they were part of something greater. Roman baths weren't just for hygiene. They were the empire in miniature, orderly, refined, and proudly extravagant. Even the smallest neighborhood baths had mosaics with cheeky Latin inscriptions or mythological scenes. These were places that soothed the body, pleased the eye, and quietly whispered, "You live in the greatest civilization on earth." But not all Romans experienced them equally. The bathhouse reflected Roman society where classes mingled, but not as equals. Wealthy patrons brought entourages and could retreat to private rooms for massages and luxury treatments. Most baths also separated genders, and in many cases, women bathed at specific hours or in less lavish facilities. Freedmen and slaves, however, were often welcome, especially those who labored hard and bathed during off hours. Still, in many ways, the baths were a tool of cultural integration. Foreigners, provincials, even outsiders once inside the steam, they were part of Rome. The empire expanded not just through military power, but by building shared rituals. The baths said, "You're one of us now." And they were more than just washing spaces. They were leisure centers. Romans exercised in the palestra, read scrolls in libraries, listened to music, or attended live performances. Food stalls sold wine, bread, and olives. Games, gossip, and politics all flowed freely. Deals were struck, debates sparked, and secrets whispered in the mist. For the elite, it was power in a towel. For everyone else, it was an escape into warmth, order, and connection. The atmosphere was relaxed, even sensual. In some corners, perhaps too relaxed. Some baths became lounges, others, brothels. Roman attitudes toward privacy and pleasure were different than ours. And yet, despite all this complexity, or perhaps because of it, the Roman bath became one of the empire's most enduring legacies. From the misty highlands of Britannia to the sands of Syria, the caldarium's heat and the frigidarium's hush united millions across borders. But no steam lasts forever, by the 5th century. As the empire fractured under war, inflation, and decay, the great baths fell into silence. The aqueducts dried, the crowds thinned, the scrolls gathered dust, and where there had been heat, now only marble remained. Religion also played a part. As Christianity became dominant, public bathing, especially mixed or nude bathing, came under increasing moral scrutiny. Church leaders saw the baths as symbols of pagan indulgence and bodily vanity. While some Christian emperors tried to preserve the public health function of the baths, others shut them down or repurposed them into churches, monasteries, or administrative buildings. And yet, the legacy of Roman baths endured. In the Islamic world, the tradition continued through hammams, bathhouse that carried forward many Roman innovations, heated rooms, steam treatments, and communal cleansing rituals. These spread across the Middle East and North Africa, preserving the essence of Roman wellness in a new religious and cultural framework. In Europe, spas and mineral baths became popular during the Renaissance and later Enlightenment, especially in places like Bath, England, and Baden-Baden, Germany. These revived bathing as a therapeutic and social activity, echoing the Roman model even as the empire itself was long gone. Today, the ruins of Roman baths still captivate visitors. The baths of Caracalla, the Stabian baths in Pompeii, and countless smaller sites across Europe and the Mediterranean remind us that Rome didn't just conquer through the sword. It conquered through comfort, engineering, and shared ritual. Roman baths may have crumbled, but their spirit lives on in our gyms, our spas, our hot showers, and our quiet moments of self-care. In a way, every time we draw a hot bath or sit in a sauna, we're channeling a bit of the empire. Steam rising, tension fading, time slowing, just as it did 2,000 years ago. In ancient Egypt, medicine didn't live in a laboratory. It lived in the temple, the home, and the world of the gods. Healing was not just a science. It was a spiritual art, and the person who treated your illness might just recite a spell while applying a pus to your wound. That's because Egyptian medicine was deeply intertwined with religion. Illness to them wasn't only about injury or infection. It could also be caused by the wrath of a god, the invasion of a malevolent spirit, or a disruption in Ma'at, the cosmic order that governed all things. So, doctors known as SWNU weren't always working alone. They often collaborated with priests who specialized in ritual and incantation. Together, they formed a dual force of treatment, one applying remedies, the other invoking divine protection. Temples were more than places of worship. They were centers of healing. Specific temples like those dedicated to Imhotep, the architect, physician, and later deified healer, served as protohosps. People would sleep there in hopes of divine dreams that revealed the source of their ailment or the cure itself. This was called incubation, and it was a respected method of diagnosis. Medical training was rigorous. Physicians studied scrolls like the Ebers' Papyrus and Edwin Smith Papyrus, which outlined hundreds of remedies, procedures, and case studies. These documents show that while the Egyptians invoked gods, they also observed symptoms, recorded outcomes, and developed surprisingly advanced techniques from wound suturing to dental care. But make no mistake, incantations were not just decorative. Many prescriptions included spells as ingredients. A broken bone might be treated with honey and linen, plus a recitation to ward off evil spirits. Psychological conditions, now recognized as mental illness, were seen as spiritual afflictions, often requiring the intervention of a priest or magician. To us, this fusion of medicine and mysticism might seem contradictory, but to the Egyptians, it was holistic. Body, mind, and spirit were part of the same continuum. Healing one meant addressing all. In the land of the Nile, to be a healer was to walk between two worlds, with one hand mixing herbs and the other raised toward the gods. Long before stethoscopes and lab tests, ancient Egyptian physicians relied on their senses and experience. They became masters of visual diagnosis, feeling pulses, examining wounds, and interpreting subtle signs in the body to understand what was wrong. Even if they believed the root cause might be spiritual, the first step in diagnosis was always observation. Physicians would examine a patient's posture, skin color, breath, and even urine or feces to search for visible or olfactory clues. Was the swelling soft or hard? Did the discharge smell sweet or foul? These observations weren't just guesswork. They were documented, compared, and passed down through generations. The pulse held particular significance. The Egyptians called it the speech of the heart. They believed that the heart was the center of a system of channels similar to a network of irrigation canals through which air, blood, and spirit flowed. If the pulse was irregular or weak, it suggested that one of these vital channels was blocked or disturbed. Although their anatomical understanding wasn't perfect, their conclusions often reflected real symptoms and led to logical treatments. Yet, when no physical explanation was found, the physician would turn to spiritual causes. Was the illness a punishment from a god, a curse from an enemy, a lingering spirit refusing to leave the body? In such cases, diagnosis involved more than examination. It required consultation with a priest, magician, dream interpretation, or even astrological analysis. The alignment of stars and the behavior of sacred animals might factor into the final verdict. In texts like the Iba's Papyrus, physicians categorized diseases based on patterns. They didn't always know why something happened, but they knew what usually followed. For instance, they could identify the stages of an infected wound or the course of a fever. These practical patterns formed the basis for treatment protocols. And interestingly, they were not always superstitious. Some medical texts explicitly separate physical ailments from spiritual ones. If a wound could be seen, smelled, and treated, no spell required. But if all else failed, it was time to invoke divine aid. To an ancient Egyptian, the world was filled with unseen forces. But through keen eyes, careful hands, and centuries of accumulated wisdom, their physicians sought to make the invisible visible. When it came to treatment, ancient Egyptian physicians had an astonishing arsenal of remedies and recipes. Their pharmacies weren't stocked with pills and injections, but with herbs, minerals, animal products, and oils, many of which they combined with surgical procedures and ritual chants. The result, a holistic approach that blended natural science with spiritual symbolism. At the heart of their medicine was the Eba's Papyrus, a 110-page scroll from around 1550 BCE. It contains over 700 prescriptions addressing everything from stomach pain and toothaches to skin diseases and fertility issues. Each recipe was tailored not just to the disease, but to the patient's body and social status, and often included precise instructions for mixing, timing, and application. One of their favorite ingredients, honey, prized for its antimicrobial properties and still used today in wound care. Honey was applied to cuts, burns, and ulcers, often mixed with other substances like crushed seeds or resin. Ancient Egyptian medicine was a blend of science, spirit, and experience far more advanced than its reputation suggests. Remedies often used ingredients like garlic, myrrh, juniper berries, and honey for their antiseptic properties. Others were more exotic: crocodile dung, hippopotamus fat, lizard blood, materials chosen not only for their physical traits, but for what they symbolized. Healing, to the Egyptians, meant restoring balance between body, spirit, and the divine. Minerals like natron cleansed wounds and preserved bodies. Oils from lotus or castor beans were used in massage. Prescriptions were often paired with spells the words themselves believed to carry power. Because in Egypt, medicine wasn't just chemistry. It was meaning. It was ritual. And yet, they were remarkably clinical when needed. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, a 3,600-year-old surgical manual, reads like a modern trauma guide. It describes skull fractures, spinal wounds, and how to treat or triage based on severity. Egyptian surgeons stitched, splinted, drained abscesses, even performed circumcisions, all without modern anesthesia. Pain was eased with opium or sedative herbs. They cleaned wounds with honey or beer and wrapped them in oil-soaked bandages. They also understood when not to operate. If removing an embedded arrowhead risked more harm, it was left in place. That shows a sharp, pragmatic understanding of the human body. Crucially, women's health wasn't an afterthought. Fertility, pregnancy, and childbirth were treated seriously. The Kahan Gynecological Papyrus, the oldest known medical text focused on women, includes diagnoses for miscarriage, infertility, and birth complications. Even pregnancy tests existed. One involved urinating on barley seeds and watching for sprouting, a method that, surprisingly, may have had some hormonal logic behind it. Contraceptives, too, were developed using natural ingredients like honey, acacia, and dates. Though some, like crocodile dung, now seem bizarre, they reflect a deep commitment to prevention and care. During childbirth, midwives led with both skill and ritual, using birth bricks and offering not just physical help, but spiritual comfort. Egyptian medicine wasn't primitive. It was practical, poetic, and deeply human, grounded in what they knew and open to what they believed. Incantations were spoken to ward off the demoness Amit, who was believed to cause miscarriages or birth complications. Protective amulets, especially those depicting Tauret, the hippo goddess of childbirth, were worn to ensure a safe delivery. If labor was difficult, treatments ranged from massaging the womb with castor oil to having the mother breathe in herbal infusions or drink mixtures to stimulate the body's opening. Caesarean sections were unknown. If the birth could not be completed naturally, tragedy often followed. Still, much of Egyptian obstetrics was remarkably advanced for its time. It reflected a culture where fertility was divine, womanhood sacred, and life itself a process watched over by both healer and God. In the cradle of civilization, they respected the cradle of life with every chant, every herb, every whispered hope. To modern minds, the blend of magic and medicine might seem contradictory, but in ancient Egypt, the two were inseparable. Healing the body meant treating the visible symptoms and the invisible forces. And sometimes the cure came as much from a spoken word as from a pus. The Egyptians believed that illness could be caused by many things: natural imbalances, bad food, injury, but also curses, malevolent spirits, or the will of angry gods. If you broke your leg in an accident, that was one thing. But if your stomach hurt for days with no visible cause, that might be a demon or even the restless soul of the dead, aka trying to torment you. In these cases, physicians turned to Heka, the sacred power of magic, which was thought to have been given to humanity by the gods themselves. Heka wasn't stage illusion. It was a legitimate divine force, just as real as water or fire. A healer might use it to activate a remedy, protect a wound from infection, or drive out an invisible entity. Spells were often included in medical texts, such as the Ebers Papyrus and the London Medical Papyrus. Some were poetic, others aggressive. One charm for treating burns reads, "Oh, Isis, great magician, I call upon you to cool the fire in the flesh of your servant, as you cooled the fire that scorched your own son, Horus." The spoken word was thought to imbue the remedy with divine power, turning herbs into miracles. Amulets were another form of protection and healing. People wore charms shaped like the eye of Horus, Ankhs, or the scarab beetle, each with symbolic significance. These amulets were believed to ward off evil, prevent disease, and protect both the living and the dead. Some were even embedded in bandages or placed directly on wounds. In ancient Egypt, healing wasn't just physical, it was cosmic. Every cure called upon balance between body, soul, and the divine. Sekhmet, feared goddess of plagues, was prayed to for healing. Thoth, god of wisdom, guided the surgeon's hands. In this world, medicine without magic was incomplete. Words, gestures, even chants were part of the prescription. Death, too, wasn't an end. It was a beginning. To reach the afterlife, the body had to be preserved with ritual, precision, and purpose. Mummification was the pinnacle of Egyptian medical spiritual practice. The body, viewed as sacred, was emptied of organs, dried with natron, perfumed with oils, and wrapped in linen, each layer accompanied by spells, hymns, and protective amulets. The process blended anatomy and ceremony. The embalmer wore the mask of Anubis. The heart, seen as the seat of emotion and thought, was often kept or replaced with a symbolic charm. The goal wasn't survival, but eternal return, preserving the vessel for the soul's journey. And yet, beyond the tombs, Egyptian medicine was anything but primitive. Papyrus scrolls revealed a system that was observed, recorded, and refined. The Ebers Papyrus, dating to 1550 BCE, listed over 700 remedies from stomach pains to tumors, often paired with rituals. The Edwin Smith Papyrus was different. A surgical manual, cool and clinical, detailing skull fractures and trauma care with astonishing clarity. Then there's the Kahan Papyrus, the earliest known text devoted entirely to women's health. Fertility, miscarriage, contraception, even surgical procedures were documented with both science and symbolism. One test for pregnancy involved barley and emmer wheat. If the grain sprouted, the woman was with child, a method modern science suggests had a small measure of accuracy. Their contraceptives, too, were innovative. Honey, acacia, and dates formed barriers. Crocodile dung, however strange it seems, was valued for its texture and spiritual weight. During childbirth, midwives led the way, offering not just physical guidance, but spiritual support on the threshold between life and eternity. Egyptian medicine was layered. Part science, part spell, and deeply human through it all. They were studied by scribes and physicians, many of whom trained at houses of life, scholarly institutions located within temples. Here, medicine was taught alongside mathematics, astronomy, and religious law. Medical apprentices would copy texts by hand, memorize spells, and observe more experienced doctors at work. The Egyptians believed in preserving and transmitting knowledge across generations. Each scroll was a distillation of experience, observation, and divine insight, often attributed to gods like Th, the deity of wisdom and writing. Physicians didn't just treat bodies. They carried forward the knowledge of millennia. Interestingly, some Egyptian medical ideas made their way to Greece, especially through figures like Hippocrates and Galen, who studied Egyptian practices and praised their methods. Egypt's influence on classical medicine is undeniable. In an age where much of the world relied on superstition alone, Egypt gave us one of the first examples of recorded, repeatable, and structured medical science. Written in ink, bound in papyrus, and passed on with purpose. Though the sands of time buried their temples and tombs, the legacy of ancient Egyptian medicine never truly disappeared. In fact, many of their practices, beliefs, and innovations quietly shaped the course of global medical history. Their echoes still felt in today's hospitals, pharmacies, and spiritual healing traditions. First, their systematic approach to medicine was revolutionary. The ancient Egyptians were more than early doctors, they were observers of life. Long before modern medicine, they understood cause and effect, hygiene, even the balance between body and mind. Cleanliness, honey, natron, and a deep respect for the body's rhythms, all this long before science gave it a name. They believed the mind could make the body ill. What they called spiritual affliction, we might call anxiety or depression. Their treatments blended herbs, rituals, and human presence. Remedies like garlic, aloe, and willow bark still linger with us, quiet reminders of how far back care truly goes. Some ideas, like crocodile dung, faded with time. Others endured, especially the healer's role. In Egypt, a physician was more than a fixer. They were a witness to pain, a guide. Healing was physical, emotional, and quietly sacred. That idea is still with us in palliative care and therapy, and perhaps the most lasting truth. People don't just want to be cured. They want to feel seen, comforted, understood. The Egyptians knew this. Their medicine was imperfect, but it was thoughtful, tender, and deeply human. So now, as the ancient lamps fade and the scrolls are rolled closed once more, let yourself drift with the quiet knowledge that healing was never just about the body. It was and still is about presence, compassion, and care. The world of the ancient Egyptians may be far behind us, but their understanding lingers in the hush of night, in the steady rhythm of breath, in the simple wish to feel whole. Let your thoughts slow. Let your body rest. You are safe, you are seen, and you are not alone. Good night, and sleep well.